All right, in this video we want to discuss the microbiology associated with the circulatory and lymphatic systems. So as always, we'll discuss the basic anatomy of these organ systems. We'll think about the defenses that these organ systems have against microbial infection, and we'll end by thinking about what microbes commonly inhabit these organ systems. So let's begin with the anatomy, and we'll begin with the anatomy of the circulatory system. So this is a well understood organ system. We've got a diagram over here on the right. For us, again, we always want to focus on the sort of the gross anatomy. What are the major structures? So the basic anatomical structures of the circulatory system for us are going to be the heart, the veins, and the arteries, right? So the function of this system is to pump blood around the body through veins and arteries to deliver oxygen to tissues, to return carbon dioxide from tissues to the lungs. There's a couple other details of the anatomy that we should be familiar with because they relate to some diseases. So one of those features would be the basic layers of heart tissue. So I just want to point out the names of these heart tissue layers and think about why they're important. So the innermost layer of the heart, so the layer of tissue that is exposed to the blood supply, that is sort of surrounding the chambers of the heart, is called the endocardium. So endo, inside, cardium of the heart. There's middle layer, the myocardium, and there's an outer layer, the pericardium. And these pieces of terminology become important because some diseases are named after these tissues. For example, there is a heart infection called endocarditis. So that is an infection of the endocardium layer. Only the endocardium and pericardium can become infected because they're actually exposed to the blood supply or the rest of the body on the outside of the heart. The myocardium is not infected because it's protected by those other two layers of tissue. So we should be aware of those names of tissue layers in the heart. The last piece of terminology related to the anatomy of the circulatory system that I think is important is to point out that the endothelium, so again, endo inside, thelium, the endothelium refers to the innermost layer of tissue in veins and arteries. So this is the layer of tissue that contacts the blood inside the veins and arteries. And that layer can be infected or damaged by infections. So for the circulatory system, that's really what we need to know. Of course, there's all sorts of anatomical terminology that can be applied to the circulatory system. So here's a labeled diagram with endless numbers or endless names for structures. Again, for us in microbiology, let's just focus on those few major structures and layers of tissues that are relevant to microbial infection. So next, let's think about the lymphatic system. So here's a diagram demonstrating the lymphatic system. Like the circulatory system, it sort of spreads out across the entirety of the body, emanating out into the limbs, just like the circulatory system does. So let's think about the major structures of the lymphatic system and why it's there. So the basic anatomical structures, again, for us, we should be aware that the lymphatic system has these lymph nodes. There's lymphatic organs like the thymus and the spleen. But that's really it, right? So a few major structures. It's this widespread system that is sort of overlaps with the circulatory system. And so let's think about what that lymphatic system does. If we zoomed in on some part of the body out here, like maybe in our hands or feet, let's think about the feet. Here's what we might observe for how the circulatory system and the lymphatic system interact. So we've got our circulatory system delivering blood to this area. Blood comes into this capillary bed where nutrients and gases can be exchanged. So oxygen is being dropped off, carbon dioxide is being picked up, and then the deoxygenated blood is leaving the area back to the lungs and heart. In these capillary beds, we see this overlap with this lymphatic tissue. So we've got these lymphatic vessels and they're sort of intertwined with this capillary bed. So why are they there and what are they doing? So in these capillary beds, what is happening is that fluid leaks out of the circulatory system tissue. So from the capillary bed, fluid that is part of the blood leaks out of the blood supply and into the tissue. And that can cause swelling in tissues. We don't want to constantly be pumping these tissues full of fluid. They'll overfill, they'll pop, right? So we have this lymphatic tissue to collect that fluid and return it to the circulatory system. So these these lymphatic vessels are collecting the fluid that was lost from the blood, and they're going to allow it to flow back to the to the circulatory system, redepositing that liquid into the circulatory system. So think of the lymphatic system as like a collection system. Because our body had to evolve this way of returning fluid back to the circulatory system, over time it was found that our body could observe what was in that lymphatic tissue, in the lymphatic liquid, observe what was in the lymphatic liquid looking for potential pathogens. So since this fluid is returning from our extremities, like a foot, if way back in evolutionary time, I stepped on something and cut my foot, that was a super common way that pathogens could enter the body. So they would get into the body, they would be in the interstitial fluid, and they might be collected by these lymphatic vessels. And that fluid would carry these pathogens back to the circulatory system. So again, we evolved a sort of a immune sort of watch system, observing this fluid for potential pathogens. And that's why the lymphatic system is so rich in white blood cells. And they're commonly found in the lymph nodes, in the thymus, and in the spleen. And all of those white blood cells in this lymphatic organs can constantly be observing that lymphatic fluid, looking for pathogens, so that if we find one, we can attack it right away. So that's the basics of the structure and function of the circulatory and lymphatic systems. All right. Next, let's think about the defenses of these systems. So what keeps them from being infected by microorganisms? So the first defense that is really strong is that, again, these organ systems are heavily populated by white blood cells in the lymphatic system and then in the blood, right? White blood cells are called blood cells because they're found commonly in the blood. And if you look at a sample of about a milliliter of blood, you'll find somewhere between 5 and 10,000 white blood cells. So if a pathogen shows up in the circulatory or lymphatic systems, there are so many white blood cells there to defend our body, that those pathogens are often quickly recognized and destroyed. So that's really great. The other defense that these systems have is that they're closed systems. So there is no sort of entry point, right? Our circulatory system does not come in contact with the outside world. So it's relatively hard for a pathogen to get into the circulatory system because there's no open door anywhere. So to get in, there has to be sort of a break in that defense. The system needs to be opened up. And that can happen, again, if you step on something with your foot and cut yourself and begin to bleed, you've opened the circulatory system. That means that another common way that microbes derive entry into the circulatory system is this parenteral entry. So again, it's a closed system. We have to pierce that system, break it to get in. Parenteral refers to that breaking. And parenteral entry often refers to needle pricks. So hypodermic needle use medically or through drug use is a particularly common way, parenteral entry, that microbes gain entry into this closed circulatory system. So just keep that terminology in mind as we move forward. So those are the defenses, super straightforward. Lots of white blood cells, and it's hard to get in because it's a closed system. What microbes do we naturally find in the circulatory and lymphatic system? So what is the natural biota? And this is a really short answer. There should be none. The circulatory system is thought to be sterile. Now, that's an oversimplification. Turns out that with modern detection techniques in laboratories, if we sample blood, we can find small numbers of microbes in the blood. But for our purposes, let's just move forward saying, in general, the blood should be sterile. In general, there are no normal microbes living in the circulatory or lymphatic systems. All right? And so with that in mind, we know that any presence of microbes in the blood is by definition an infection, right? Remember, infection is inappropriate growth of microbes. So any microbes in the blood means that our blood is infected. And with that in mind, as we end, I just want to point out some terminology related to blood infections. So you might see words that end in this part of the word emia, and that just means blood infection. So you may come across terminology like viremia. And so all that means is that we can detect viruses in the blood. Virus, emia, blood, viremia, viruses in the blood. So the same thing could be said for fungemia, right? Fungus in the blood. Bacteremia, bacteria in the blood. And then maybe the most common piece of terminology you will come across that ends in emia would be septicemia. This is the same as saying someone is septic. And that again just means that there are microbes growing in the blood. So septic shock, septicemia, microbial growth in the blood. It's actually a really dangerous condition, which we'll talk about more another time in our class. So that's where we'll end with the circulatory and lymphatic systems. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know, and I will talk to you again soon.